Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Markowitz.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we are talking about emotions.
Yeah.
Are you okay, so this came from us having a lot of conversation around emotion this past week.
Well, specifically creating content around emotions this last week. We've entered the platform of videos. Now, it's not like we haven't had videos before. We had a series of YouTube videos around each of the personality types and a couple other videos just, I don't know, like serendipitously on our YouTube channel, not planned in any way. But now that we're doing a content schedule this fall around different avenues or aspects of our personal development, we decided that we were going to focus on the platform of creating YouTube videos. And now you've got a channel and I've got a channel, and Cheris and Chelsea, both people who work with Personality Hacker, have channels. And so we're all creating content around different topics of personal development. So last week was on emotions, which is why we recorded a podcast on emotions. We each recorded YouTube videos on emotions. And
holy crap.
Well, it wasn't like we got an influx or anything, but there was a couple different comments based on my video and your video. Because my video was on changing your emotional thermostat, which is effectively this idea that we have a comfort zone of emotions and we can, change where our comfort zone is. And I suggested that we could raise our emotional thermostat by getting out of some of the more negative emotions and finding positive emotions more of our comfort zone. And then your video was on changing negative emotions to positive emotions. So some of the kickback that we got, or some of the responses that we got, were, number one, why are we assuming that emotions can be negative or positive? Like, why are we giving evaluations to emotions?
Yeah.
And the second was, why are we assuming that positive emotions are the emotions we want to be feeling? And why would we want to get ourselves out of negative emotions? I even made the comment in my video that certain emotions could be low vibration, which also had a comment, a response that was like, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that those emotions are low vibration. So really what we've been talking about since we got those comments back was this concept of, and the one more thing that you mentioned that it got a little bit of response was that you said that we are, that nobody can make us feel any emotion.
Yeah.
That we are the people who are in control of the emotional experience that we have.
That's a belief of mine.
Yeah.
I believe that we as humans are completely in control of our own experience.
Right.
As far as our perception goes.
So I just named like 4 different things that I'm assuming that people listening, there's going to be a certain subset of people out there who are like, I disagree with absolutely everything you just said.
So we talked about some of those different issues in these videos. One thing that is interesting about this new format of video we're going into, it's a whole new world for us in content creation. We've been developing these podcasts for over 2 years now. We've got,
almost 3.
When you count in the almost 3, so coming up on 3 years, and when you count in like the PHQs, we're like approaching around 200 episodes, and we've released them once a week for a while. And they're long, 45-minute conversational toned subject matter, right? So you and I have a conversation, we unpack a lot of nuance, we talk about maybe some of the objections that would come up around a topic, and we really get to the meat of an issue through discussion. You can't do that in a 5-minute video, a 10-minute video. I mean, you're like, and it's just one of us on these video channels. We're looking at the camera, we're giving a lot of information very quickly. It's, a lot of these videos are edited, fast-paced. And so I think we are learning to communicate in a video format in a much better way. So this is a little bit of a learning process for us. I think the messages in the videos I still stand behind them. But I think I'm learning that we need to give a little more, there's a little more nuance here in the video that I would like to add in. So this podcast is a way for us to talk a little bit about some of the things that we meant in those videos. And then maybe as we go forward, we're going to help craft some of that into video as we go forward. So
yeah, exactly. I think with the video, we're still learning how to have a more concise, pithy statement that doesn't necessarily derail from, the ultimate message.
Yeah.
And it's hard to, like you said, it's hard to do that so quickly.
It's hard to establish context. Well, that's why the news media has trouble, because it does in sound bites.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
You can't have 45-minute conversations about one little topic.
Right, exactly. And so, yeah, exactly. It's like a 5-minute video feels more soundbitey. So going back to this conversation around the emotions itself, though, so that we do have a platform in which we can unpack it, which is great.
Yeah.
the first thing that I want to talk about is this idea of whether or not you can control your emotions. And we read, you and I both independently, I think we probably just put the same sentence into a search feature, and it came up as one of the first articles on Psychology Today, which is, can you control your emotions? And there was a really good article that I think the guy's name was Jeremy Sherman. He's a doctor that writes for Psychology Today, Jeremy Sherman. And he wrote this article on whether or not you can control your emotions. And he described these two camps. And one camp tends to fall into the positive psychology camp, and the other one is a little less pushed by any particular group. The first theory is that you have total control over your emotions. And it's definitely in this concept around like cognitive therapy and positive psychology, which is that you 100% are in control of all of your emotions. And there are some reasons why people, feel this way, believe that is true, and also why they encourage other people to believe that is true. There is some good that comes from that. And then the other side of the camp, which is usually more reactionary to that, is this idea that you have no control over your emotions, that when you tell people your emotional experience, all you're doing is simply reporting it. Now, there's dangers to both sides and there's positives to both sides. So his question was like, well, what's the in-between? Because both of them are unrealistic.
Extremes.
They're both extremes. And so what falls in the middle? And then he said, well, there's more probability. And he called it some omnipotence. Instead of omnipotence, it's somnipotence, meaning that sometimes you do have complete and total control over your emotions and experience, and other times not so much. And you and I were talking about it, based again on those videos that you made the comment that nobody can make you feel anything. And yeah. I do want to unpack what you mean by that, because I think that you have there's a really powerful concept that comes behind that, but it's something that is a pretty nuanced statement. So I think that needs to be unpacked a little bit in a moment. But this idea that you have full and total control, I think, is actually not an in the moment statement. It's a long game statement. It's an over time statement, meaning that if you feel like you have no control over your emotions, that you're simply experiencing them, then at no point will you feel any incentive to build the skill of attempting to control them. And if you believe you do have control, full total control over your emotional experience, then you will go toward building skill. And then you eventually will have far more control, even in the moments when your emotions are heightened. So that's the big question, is you're in this massive emotional whirlwind and you're just your emotions are spiking and you just feel so you feel like this thing is happening to you. The question of, can you fully control your emotion in that moment? The answer is, it depends.
Yeah.
It depends. What level of skill development have you built up to this point to be able to control that emotion?
Yeah.
And one of the ways that you can tell that people actually do have a lot more control over their emotions than they'll even report is somebody will behave one way in the privacy of their home. And if they get displaced into a public context, all of a sudden that emotional experience is way different.
Yeah.
Right? A person will feel like this emotion is happening to them, one of extraordinary, say, anger, to a point where they're screaming at their spouse. And if they were just to be whammed to the middle of a supermarket, they would instantly stop screaming, because the social pressure of not screaming would now become very real. And so if not the actual emotion itself, definitely the behaviors that follow the emotions.
The expression of that emotion is altered by your social condition.
That's right. Or your social surroundings. And so when people say, I have no control over this, I mean, sometimes I call a little BS on it, because I'm like, well, that's only because you're in a space where you feel like you're safe. So yeah. I think we have a lot more control over our emotional expression anyway.
Well, I think that's what we teach kids initially. I think for my children, one of the things I'm working on right now, all three of them, 10, 8, and 4 at the time of this recording, we're both working on this, is get control of your emotional expression. You can't just cry and scream in the middle of a supermarket when you're upset about something. You might still feel upset. That can be an authentic emotion, but it's not okay to express it in an unhealthy way in this setting right now.
Well, in a manipulative way.
Yeah.
In a way where you're using your emotional expression to emotionally blackmail somebody else. You're using it as a weapon at that point. And so we're trying to de-weaponize emotions.
Yeah.
So then that's your emotional expressions. The question is, well, what about the emotion itself? And what's difficult about filleting out this concept of the emotional expression versus the emotion is that they're so intertwined. Your emotional expression does feed back into the emotion you're experiencing. And the emotion you're experiencing feeds into your emotional expression or behavior. Let's call them emotion and behavior. The behavior, which is the emotional expression. Your behavior feeds back into the emotion. In the article, Sherman mentions that you have a situation where you're being confronted with somebody who's just insulted you or said something that has like spiked your resentment or something that feels really icky towards the other person. But you choose not to say anything about that. You choose, instead of getting resentful, you choose to get forgiving, right? You choose to go into at least behaving as if you're forgiving. And so you act in a kind way to the other person, and then their response completely de-escalates. And so all of a sudden now you don't feel the same way you felt before about them because the situation de-escalated and they showed up in a better way towards you. And so now you, like, within 10 minutes, if the situation continues to de-escalate, you didn't have to go from feeling resentment to pretending to not feel resentment anymore. You went from resentment to actually being forgiving within that 10 minutes.
Yeah.
The behaviors fueled back into crafting the emotional experience. So in some ways, the way that we express our emotions is part of the emotion. It feeds it back into it so we can control our emotions through our behaviors.
And I do this all the time in my life. Like yesterday, I was feeling down a little bit. I had when I woke up, I was like, oh man. I put headphones in. I went out on the back porch. It was still warm out, even though it's starting to turn cooler this season. I raised my arms out, stretched up to the sky, looked straight up into the air, and put a big smile on my face and just listened to my music for like 5 minutes. And within 5 minutes, my actual emotions inside myself started to change. I realized it didn't happen literally within 10 seconds. It took me about 5 minutes to rewire my emotional expression or my emotional feeling for the morning. But I had a much better day because I did that. And so I think there's this idea that I can use a behavior, like a physicality behavior, like my body and my mind or my face looking up toward the sky, feeling the sunshine on my face, putting a smile on my face, opening up my kind of like my eye sockets, even though my eyes were closed, like opening them up with my eyebrows raised. And now I started to feel better. Like there's an emotional response to my physicality. It's really interesting to see this play out in your life. Try this sometime. It's really weird how you can change how you feel. And if you want to feel really sad, just go and like put your head down in your hands and like look down at the floor and start to think about sad things and lower your eyebrows, and you'll probably start feeling sad. It's really interesting how your body can shape how you feel just by moving your physicality in a different direction. Just that alone is interesting to me.
Well, and what you just say, I mean, that's been my experience too. And what you're saying right now is if you want to feel sad, ... And that goes back into the second point, which is, should we assume that we always want to be feeling what we call positive emotions? Or should we be assigning evaluations to emotions at all?
Yeah.
So
do you want to go on to that now? Because we haven't talked yet about the whole...
No control?
The first part that you had said you wanted to unpack originally about the no control part. Do you want to hit all these a little bit and then go back, or do you want to hit them one at a time?
Well, I think I want to talk about the no control piece as we're talking about the negative positive piece, because I think unfortunately...
Because I've got a metaphor I want to share, and I don't want to do it until you feel complete on what you're saying, I guess.
Why don't you share your metaphor?
Okay.
Yeah, and then we'll go into the next piece.
So I kind of look at controlling emotions, this idea of, are we in control of our emotions or are we not? In the same way I would say, are we in control of our unconscious mind or are we not? Or something that's even more tangible, I think would be more helpful for this conversation is, are we in control of our dreams or are we not? A lot of people think that our dream world happens to us at night, but there are techniques that you can learn over time. It's called lucid dreaming, to basically take control of your unconscious dream world while you're still asleep. And you can be consciously aware that you're dreaming and you can direct your dreams. Some people just show up to life having this ability. They just are born with the ability while they're dreaming to control their dreams. Other people train themselves over time to be able to take control of their dreams by doing little techniques, practicing during the day, asking yourself questions like, am I dreaming or am I asleep? And then that translates into your dream world at night. So they practice disciplines and they develop the skill of being able to control or take control or more control of their dreams depending on how much skill they put into it or how much practice they put into it. So I think those two things, your unconscious mind, can you actually control your unconscious mind, like the things that come, your thoughts that come into your head, how you are thinking about things, and can you control your dreams? These two metaphors, or these two ideas, I guess, I don't know if they're metaphors, that might be the wrong word, but these two ideas I think are helpful in thinking about emotions in a similar way. And I think emotions are actually even more tangible than those two examples. I think those two examples are a little bit more abstract, more difficult than even emotions. I would say to control your dream world is more difficult than to control the feeling of emotions or the expression of emotions coming up into you. And there's really those two fronts on that, the feeling and the expression of the feeling. I think those are actually more accessible to more people than, let's say, lucid dreaming or the unconscious mind. So that's kind of how I think about this, in a sense that you can't control your unconscious mind completely, but you can have influence over it. Breathing techniques, if you're meditating and you're learning how to breathe, you're basically hacking into the biofeedback system of your unconscious, because usually our breathing is done unconsciously. We just breathe all day and we don't think about it. If you take conscious control of the breathing, now you have an access point into the unconscious mind because the breathing is connected to the unconscious mind. So that's why breath work, for example, is so important in meditation, in all these different mental practices of taking control of presence and mindfulness. It's because you're getting access to something you usually wouldn't have access to. So it's a technique to do that. And I think emotions are very similar. There's ways to access emotions similarly to the unconscious mind. And I believe it's a more tangible access point than even the unconscious mind or like the dream world. So that's what I wanted to share before we got too much further, to start giving us an idea of how we can look at this, because it isn't full control of your emotions and it isn't just happening to you. And the other thing I want to say is, before we move forward too, is this idea that you are not in control of your emotions, to me, is weird, because I don't understand how anyone can, I don't personally know how anyone can get inside my head or my heart and make me feel anything. They don't have the perception filters I have. They cannot reach inside me and interpret situations for me to tell me how to feel something. I have to interpret the data set for myself to feel what I'm feeling. So it would be like me asking, show me a reality outside of my own experience. Like, Antonia, show me a reality outside of me being able to experience what you're showing me. And that's impossible for you to do, because for you to show it to me, I have to see it or filter it through my processing filters to experience it. It's like the same thing with emotions. It's like, how do I get emotion projected onto me? It's impossible, because it is my experience. This is the only experience I have. How could you project something into my own experience? It's totally on me to experience what's going on for me. So those are all the things I think about around this that we can start unpacking. But I want to get that out before we move too much further down the road. I thought that was relevant to the first topic we were talking about.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to speed along through here. There was something about the next point that I thought was relevant to actually the first point, which is the thing about emotions is that they all just kind of, all of these concepts relate to each other when it comes to an emotional experience.
Yeah.
So basically what you're trying to say, though, is when you say, show me something that's outside of my experience, is try to implant, for example, try to implant the color purple into my mind if I've never seen the color purple. Like, that's basically what you're saying. Like, how can you make me feel an emotion if I don't have that emotion already inside of me?
Well, and
to call upon.
Even taking that metaphor to its fullest, let's say I have seen the color purple. That's what I have categorized as color purple. I might be colorblind. I might be seeing actually red. I think it's purple because it matches what you point to as purple, but it's my perception of what purple is. So even if you say, think about the color purple, you actually can't see or control what I'm actually thinking about, because my color purple is mine. Like, that's how I've written it in my own heart and mind. My own perception has cataloged it to be my representation of that. So you could say something, and I think this is where personality typology can come down, because I have authenticity, FI. This feels like a no-brainer to me. The fact that I am like mirroring an emotion. You're not giving me an emotion. I'm choosing to like resonantly, almost like a tuning fork, go dong, and match what I perceive to be the tone you're trying to have me match you with. And I think that with like the color purple, it's like I'm bringing up the image in my mind that I've cataloged as my personal perception of the color purple. There is no objective color purple. That doesn't exist. You have a subjective representation. I have a subjective representation. And if I see the color purple in my mind when you say that, I brought that up. You didn't bring that up. I brought that up, and it's mine. It's my version of that. I think that's what I mean by, I think you were probably going there. I'm really excited about this. It's emotions. So I think that's what you're probably trying to hint at, right?
Yeah. Well, and as far as your statement that there is no objective color purple, I think the closest we get is a consensus definition.
Yeah.
And then we assume that consensus definition means objective. And it's not. It's just a consensus definition. And I think we do that with emotions too.
Absolutely.
There's no like specific, like all of us experience these emotions very subjectively, very personally. And then there's these consensus definitions of what, say, sadness is supposed to be or joy. And then we think that those are objective definitions, but really they're just consensus definitions because it is so profoundly subjective. So I'm glad that you mentioned all that stuff because like everything that you just said is like in my mind is like tagged for future reference in the podcast, especially when you mentioned personality type coming into this, because I think personality type absolutely like.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that people assume that typology influences that I don't think does, but I think our emotional experience is absolutely one where typology comes in a very relevant way.
It's more the relationship we have with our emotional experience.
Yes.
I think typology really influences.
And our opinion of how it should be done, I think is very much woven into our judging process. Specifically, what is our judging process? Because our judging processes are either thinking or feeling. And our thinking and feeling, those are all of those processes are very should statement oriented because there are evaluations, our evaluations of how things should be are all wrapped up into our decision making or our judging processes. And then on top of it, they are specifically whether or not we're going to be taking these emotional considerations into account. And our emotions are what determine how important something is to us and how little important something is. So emotions are very tied into our judging process, which is very tied into our personality type. So I do think that that's a big piece of it. But going back to what we said before, which was this idea of like total control versus no control. And one of the reasons why I wanted to mention the second piece, which was whether or not emotions should they be called negative or positive, is because this idea of total control of emotions is very much part of like the positive psychology movement. And as Sherman mentions in his article, there are some implicit statements in there that there are certain emotions that are better than others. And, it's like, well, if you want to feel like in your video, Joel, you mentioned how to get from a negative emotion to a positive emotion. And there's basically some assumptions in there that you want to be feeling positive emotions and not negative ones. Thus, potentially in some people's minds, demonizing certain emotions and raising other emotions up. So Sherman mentions in the total control perspective of emotions, one of the things that comes out of that or can come out of that is this idea of you should be feeling quote unquote positive emotions all the time. And there's articles that have been written on this and books that have been written on this idea of if you don't feel permission to feel your full spectrum of emotions, that's not any healthier than being in what people would call negative emotions all the time.
Yeah.
So the reason why I wanted to mention this idea of evaluating emotions as either negative or positive is because it does feel back into this idea of total control of emotions. Are we saying, when we say we can control our emotional experience, even if we're saying over the long game, not even necessarily in an individual moment, are we insinuating that when you get to a point where you can control your emotional experience, should you be doing that at all times, and should it always be a positive experience?
Yeah, like when I was a teenager, I went to Jamaica on like this service trip, right, to go build some houses in Jamaica. And I remember we went one of the days into a disabled children's home where they were like in medical treatment, orphans that were in medical treatment in really bad ways. If I go into that environment and I'm like, oh, I should feel a positive emotion in here and like I can bring positivity to the people there, but I want to feel the impact of that experience, and that might feel negative in the moment. Like I might feel sad and like really helpless to help the people that are in this environment, but that's an appropriate emotion for that situation. I don't think I or you or anyone that would be sophisticated talking about this would say you should never feel bad emotion. I think in that context, for example, or, a loved one is passing away, it's okay to feel and express what quote unquote are typically anchored as bad or negative emotions. I think from the feedback from these videos, though, I have thought a lot about how to recontextualize talking about emotion. I'll still have some bad habits of saying positive, negative, but I probably will remove that language and use something different as far as I'm concerned around that. And I don't know if you feel the same way, Antonia, but it's what is useful in the moment. It's more about useful emotion versus unuseful emotion. So if I'm feeling really icky and bad and I'm bringing all that unuseful emotion, which maybe I've categorized as negative in the past, to a situation, causing other people to be worked up and upset or whatever, and it's not appropriate for the situation, I need to probably shift into something that's more useful. And in that particular situation might be more positive, what classically, quote unquote, is defined as positive. So if you're listening and you get triggered around this idea of a positive or negative emotion, just remove that completely, because that sounds like there's a valuation or evaluative stance on the emotion itself. Just put useful or unuseful. Because all emotions, I believe, especially as a authenticity person and introverted feeler, I believe all emotions can be useful in the right context. And I think they're all accessible to us as humans, and that's part of how I want to show up to the world, and I would love other people to have the ability to show up and express themselves fully for the appropriate context with the appropriate emotion. I think that's the goal of this whole thing.
Well, I remember there was a comment in our Intuitive Awakening group, our Facebook group, where a person said, well, even emotions that are considered inappropriate could still be, if basically have some use. And I've been thinking a lot about that. What I actually, more often than using the phrase negative emotion, I use the word toxic. And I think you just mentioned a really important word, which is context. Context is so important for everything. I'm at a point right now where I almost can't handle non-contextual thinking. It's something that's it drives me crazy, because whenever anybody asks me a question or whenever anybody posits any form of perspective on the world, the first thing I think of is, yeah, but what context are you talking about it in? So I've gotten to a point where, even isms, capitalism versus socialism or communism, I'm just like, yeah, but what's the context?
Yeah.
Everything is now context to me. And I think when I use the words negative or positive emotions or even toxic emotions, specifically I'm referring to emotions that threaten the length of your life. That's really what it comes back to. Is for me, when I think of a negative or a toxic emotion, I'm actually not talking about the specific emotion in and of itself. I think every single emotion has, there's a reason they evolved. They all do us a service at times. But certain emotions, if we hold on to them, or if we live there, if we can't let go of them, or if we get addicted to them, can become toxic in the way that things can be physically poisonous to us. They will shorten our life. For example, if somebody lives in the emotion of resentment, and there's a phrase called harboring resentment. Do you harbor resentment, or do you forgive, or what's your style? And I've always thought that was a really interesting phrase, harboring resentment. A harbor is a place that is a safe place for ships. It's where we bring our ships in, and that's a harbor. And it's the place where if there's storms going on outside, our ship or a boat is going to be okay because it's in the harbor, it's protected. So when we talk about harboring emotions or harboring something like resentment, we're actually talking about protecting them. We're talking about keeping them safe, and so nothing can threaten that emotion or take it from us.
Yeah.
It's a form of addiction. And at that point, the emotion itself may not be toxic, but our relationship to the emotion certainly is. And if we harbor, emotions like resentment or anger or some of the ones that are quote unquote negative, if we harbor them, then they will literally shorten our life. They produce stress. They make us less happy overall. They make it so that our relationships are less fulfilling because we can't get through these emotions, especially if we have a tendency to default to them or get they're easily triggered within us. So it's not the emotion itself that's negative or positive. It's a relationship to the emotion that's negative or positive. And if we're harboring any set of emotions, then those, I think that's basically what's being said with this idea of if we force positivity down everybody's throat, that has just as bad of a response as protecting these negative ones. And I would say that's accurate too, Because what we're doing is we are getting addicted to the positive ones and not allowing ourselves to feel negative ones.
Yeah.
Just like we can get addicted to the negative ones and not allow ourselves to feel positive ones, which is basically what my video was about. Is your emotional thermostat more likely to be set towards emotions that if you feel them all the time, like your life will be shortened by these?
Yeah.
And are you able to raise your thermostat up and feel the kind of emotions that if you have a tendency to default to them will actually lengthen your life because they are overall healthier to default to?
Yeah.
So it's not even so much, I like the concept of the useful or not useful, but I think even going one step further is more of the relationship, like taking it out of the emotion itself and more focusing attention on the relationship that we have with these emotions. And there are certain emotions that if we default to them, they will harm us.
Yeah.
And other emotions don't do that as much. Like if you have a tendency to harbor or go toward, and I think this is where the positive psychology field is more looking at, quite honestly, as opposed to saying you can never feel negative emotions. I think what they're trying to insinuate is that if you default to this certain subset or cluster of emotions, joy, happiness, fulfillment, satisfaction, if you default to that, you are going to have a better experience in life and probably a longer life than if you default to anger, resentment, sadness, dysthymia, depression. That will actually shorten your life and you're going to have a worse time of it in life. So in the context of that, there are positive and negative emotional clusters, or at least depending on our relationship with them.
Yeah. Well, I think those negative ones can be useful as tools. Wow. Okay. A lot of things that you just said that I'm like, I wanted to talk, but I was like letting you finish. The idea of looking at emotions and what helps extend your life is probably the most quote unquote objective way you could possibly look at it. Like if you're trying to measure this, how would you measure this? Because I look at it more in a more like tangible, immediate way. What increases the quality of my life, not necessarily the length of my life. And the reason I do that is because the reason why you're harboring resentment is somehow your unconscious mind or your ego believes that is going to extend your life. For some reason, you feel like harboring resentment towards your spouse or this person that's wronged you. Somehow your ego wants to stay alive, and it's using that, it's tricking itself to say, this is going to keep me alive longer if I hold on to this resentment, which it probably won't biologically, but your mental, like as people, we think that's going to help us in some way survive longer, or our ego survive longer. And that's, I think, why we hold on and harbor certain emotions that anchor into us because of that metric. So I still like the metric. I think that length of life is important. And I think if you're looking for the most objective way, there are emotions that will actually kill your RNA. There are emotions that will actually help repair your RNA, right? Like, I don't have the exact science here. I've read this somewhere. I probably should look it up and link to it in the notes. But there are emotions that can actually harm your physical body. They drag you down. They make you feel tired. Stress. Stress is a killer. And stress is related to a lot of different emotions that come up for you. Maybe you're worried about money and it causes stress, and now your body's taking a hit from that, and you're shortening the length of your life. So if you're looking for an objective measurement of positive or negative emotion, quote unquote, however we want to categorize that, that's probably the closest thing we have to an objective measurement.
Well, and I just want to mention that acknowledging that there are certain emotions that we might define as negative need to be felt. If you, say, are in a situation where you have had a major traumatic loss and you don't allow yourself to experience grief over that, that will cause stress. Or if you have taken a hit where you feel righteous indignation of an action and you don't let yourself feel that, that will also produce stress. So maybe even the objective criteria is what is causing stress to your body. Because if you don't allow some of these quote unquote negative emotions, that itself will create stress.
Yeah, and so as an example of context that you mentioned earlier about what's appropriate, inappropriate, or useful, not useful, positive, not positive, or negative, or whatever, I look at the example of most people in the planet would rather die than get up in front of somebody in public and give a speech, right? Most people just freak out when they've got to do public speaking. That's a common phrase. A lot of people are really nervous about getting in front of other people. And what happens is you feel fearful, you feel nervous, you feel like everybody's going to look at you. The emotion you're going through, like what your body and your physicality is going through in your heart and mind is like, I'm going to die. I could possibly die if I stand up on stage and talk to a group of people. Like you have all these emotions come up. in that context, that's like, it's not like it's a bad thing to feel. We all feel it. We all feel nervousness and we have to work through it. But that's a response that's built into our wiring. If you're on the Serengeti 200,000 years ago and there's a lion coming after you, you want that same mechanism to hit in, so you run away from the lion and you don't get eaten. That's how we're wired. That's how we've evolved to have some of these emotions come up for us, the stressors that come up for us, the fear, the negativity, whatever. Oh crap, my life's in danger. I got to go climb that tree or get away or hide in a hole or whatever. Now, translated to the modern world, contextually, that's not as useful to us getting on stage. So we have to learn techniques to control these fight, flight, or freeze responses that come up for us. That's a real basic example of an emotion that serves us in one context. And even in the modern world, you're in a back alley somewhere and you feel the little hairs on the back of your neck stand up and you're like, I feel fearful. I feel a little stressed right now. There's a dark shadow down the end of that down the end of that alleyway. I need to be vigilant and maybe even run for my life at any moment. Like, that's a useful emotion in that moment. But going into like your first date with somebody, that's not as useful of emotion because you're going to show up all skittish and weird and like turn them off and be like extra like stumbling over your words and things. So like, like there's context for where these things show up for you. So again, I think I want to just reiterate that you said like all of the quote unquote negative or unuseful emotions. When I say unuseful, I mean in context of certain things, they're all useful at some point. It just means you don't want to live there. I mean, really, you want to live under stress and fear all the time in your life? And I know people that do this. And some people say, well, that's a full authentic expression for them. Really? Like, I mean, yeah, that might be authentic, but is that healthy? Is that what we want to have in that situation? Come on, guys. Like, that's how I feel about it.
Well, and it also, going to the direction of no control over emotions, the challenge there is this idea that we're static, that we're not flexible, that we're not able to change. I mean, there's been so much research done on the plasticity of our minds. Where do we think our emotions live? They live in our neural wiring. The plasticity of our minds indicates that everything that is housed within the mind is also going to have a measure of plasticity to it. So if our emotions are fundamentally all part of our neural wiring, then that means that they have the ability to be flexible. And I would almost say that the relationship with our emotions and to see how much control we have over them is similar to how much control we have over our memetics or our abilities to like see the world through certain paradigms. Would you ever tell somebody that they don't have control over their outlook in life or they don't have control over their religious experience? I think most of us would find that to be kind of insulting, that we don't have control over a religious experience or control over a mimetic or paradigmatic experience. But then when we say we're supposed to have control over our emotional experience, now that's for some reason not nearly as, that's more offensive. It's like offensive to say you don't have control over your mimetics, but you do have control over your emotions. Well, what if you have control over all of it? But I think what trips people up is that the assumption is that we have control over these things at all time, at all moments. And that's not something that we're trying to insinuate. I don't think that's a possibility. But I do think that you can build skill in all of this. I think that you can build skill in controlling your emotions over the long game. And you can get to a point where you get so good at it. Like you've gotten to a point, Joel, where you're so good at controlling your emotional experience, you can just about do it on a dime. That's not something I've developed yet, but you're also an ENFP. An introverted feeling is your auxiliary process, or what we call your co-pilot. And so because of that, this is a world that is a lot more, this is a more natural world for you than it is for me.
I'm more interested, it's more accessible to me more than most, like other people that don't have the same judging process in their stack.
Exactly. I'm using introverted thinking, and I talk about, am interested in, pursue skill around more mimetic, skill and control. So, I mean, that's just where our attention naturally lies. And I do think that your personality type is going to come into this. If you're a judger, you're a J in the Myers-Briggs system, and that means that your judging process or your decision-making process is going to be extroverted or turned out to the outside world. It means that you're probably going to have more of a concept around controlling your emotions than maybe a perceiver would. Because to a judger, their evaluative criteria is going based on how it's impacting the outside world. So if everybody just gets to show up however they want to emotionally, that destabilizes all of society, because suddenly we're not caring at all. Like the example I gave before, which is the person who is like screaming at their spouse, but then gets dumped in a supermarket. If there's no social pressure at all to not be screaming at your spouse in a supermarket, guess what's going to happen all the time at all supermarkets? It's going to be filled with people screaming at their spouses. And like it would be, it's a slippery slope argument, but it could turn into chaos and anarchy.
I have noticed when people are on their cell phones, they feel way more permission to scream at each other than in social, like if they're in like real life. Have you noticed this? Like people will be walking on the street or like in a store and like, I told you, blah, blah, blah. They're screaming. I'm like, how did we somehow not wire that socially to be like okay or whatever?
Well, we probably will soon. And there is like a gray area there. It's like the anonymity of the conversation, because when the person's on the other side of the phone, you don't know what their context is, so you're going to reserve judgment. Whereas if you've got two people looking at each other in like a restaurant and they're like having a fight, it's a little easier to judge from afar, even though you don't know what's going on. They're going to feel it's easier to judge them. So I think that's probably what it is. We do things based on how much we think we can get away with effectively. So this idea of controlling your emotions for the outside world is probably going to trend toward being more of a judge or thought. And this idea of feeling permission to feel whatever your authentic emotional expression is at any moment is going to trend toward more of a perceiver thought.
So you're talking specifically about the expression of the emotion, not the emotion itself right now.
Exactly, where the behavior piece. Whereas the actual relationship to the emotion, I would say having permission to be in an emotional experience is going to trend more towards a feeler thought, whereas thinkers are going to want to, naturally control their own personal emotional experience more. That's going to be more of a thinker position.
It's not their sandbox.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't feel as comfortable working in that realm, working with that medium, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
As I think feelers do.
Yeah, so your type is definitely going to influence how you show up in this. And I would say probably the people who are the most protective of feeling the full array of emotional experience and not wanting any emotion to be demonized are probably going to be the IFPs, people who lead with introverted feeling. Introverted feeling is very much about understanding the full array of your emotional experience and not wanting to see any of them as necessarily negative or positive, and wanting to have full permission to go wherever they want to on that stratum.
Think of like a piano, like the full keys on a piano. I would say introverted feeling wants to be able to see the entire key spread on a piano and know that they can go all the way to the lowest key and all the way to the highest key for true fidelity at any moment. They don't want to just select like 8 keys in the middle. They want to be able to play that entire range of emotions. Mm-hmm. And they want to have access to that at all times and not feel like they're bad or wrong for wanting that.
Absolutely. I think that that's a fantastic metaphor, actually, because there is no single key on that keyboard that is a bad key.
Yeah.
However, when your 4-year-old toddler is up at a piano and slamming her fists against the entire thing, right? All of a sudden now we do have a concept of negative or positive.
This is metaphorical, right?
All of these have been pulled from our personal experiences. It's very personal to us. And that is a very personal statement, because every time she gets anywhere near grandma and granddad's piano, I'm just like, oh, Piper, stop. Right? It is a negative experience because it's wounding my ears as she just slams her hands against it. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here with this concept of emotions. It's like there's no single emotion that is bad or wrong. And everybody should feel complete and total permission to hit whichever key, feel whichever emotion that they need to be feeling in that moment. However, if you start slamming your hands against the keys, somebody might come along and go, hey, there's a more skilled way at doing this. There's a way where you can play the music of your emotions so that it is more a pleasant experience for you. It is more a pleasant experience for everybody else who's listening. And you're going to have just an overall better time of it, as opposed to just slamming your fingers or slamming your hands down on all of this quote unquote emotion.
I think music's a great metaphor to keep extending too, because as we go through life, it's just like a movie you're watching. If you're watching a thriller or a monster movie, you have like these low, like dum 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 tones. If you're watching a romantic comedy, like dum 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 dum, like it's really appropriate for the context it's in. So I think this is a metaphor maybe we can stretch into the rest of the conversation in some ways.
Yeah. And
okay, so we have been rambly talking a little bit, not rambling, but we've been talking a lot around these topics around emotion. And if you're listening, and you're a usual listener, you're used to making connections on your own. So I think you probably have already gotten some ahas and some distinctions that you're making in your own mind maybe based on what we've said, or we've triggered something for you, and you're like, oh, what if it works this way? You're probably making connections. But let's just do a quick review. Where are we at with all of this? We talked like about 3 things. Let's kind of tie this together here and find some common ground about where we can go from here. We talked about this idea, are you in absolute control of what you feel, or do those things happen to you? So that's, do emotions come up for you, or are you absolutely in control of writing your own emotions? That's one part of it. Yeah,
and I think basically what we came down on with that is that sometimes you're in complete control and sometimes you're not. But over the long game, over time and skill development, you're going to tip the scale over into being more in control in the moment.
And that's a little different than, can you, Antonia, make me, Joel, feel an emotion? I believe that's a different topic. That's a separate topic. Do emotions come up? Do they bubble up for me, or do I bring them bubbling up? Is the first part. And the second part is, can someone else force an emotion to either bubble up for you or you to create that emotion? And my positing on that, my deep held belief, being an authenticity person, being an introverted feeler, and having the perspective I have, is that is impossible. You are ultimately, maybe you're not in control at all times of the emotions that come up for you, but you certainly are ultimately responsible for the emotions that come up for you, because no one else can be. How is that possible in my mind?
Well, because you wrote that emotion in the first place.
Yeah.
So because you are the person...
You cataloged it.
Yeah, the emotion is housed within your mind, and you cataloged it exactly. So even if another person outside of you or in a circumstances or environment triggers the emotion, it's still ultimately your emotion.
It's your representation of that emotion. Just like the color purple, it's your representation of that emotion.
Yeah, exactly.
So those 2 things we talked about. And I feel very firmly that no one else can make you feel an emotion, that sometimes emotions do bubble up, but over time, just like with tapping in your unconscious mind, you can begin the practice of pulling up and bubbling up the emotions you would like to have, whatever those are. Could be sadness, could be happiness, whatever it is. But you do have more control of that over the long game.
And then the third thing we talked about was whether or not emotions should be categorized as either positive or negative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we came down on that one is that it's completely context dependent, and ultimately the ultimate gauge is how much are you extending or shortening your life based on this emotional experience.
And I would add, how much are you increasing or decreasing the quality of your life? If you have to get up on stage and give a presentation and you always have fear coming up for you, you're decreasing the quality of the presentation you might be able to give or have an experience that you want to have. If you, every time you get to with your spouse and you're supposed to have a date night and you have negative stuff come up for you, you're decreasing the quality of intimacy and date night you could have with your spouse. So usefulness, unusefulness comes to play into this, and also context. Is it lengthening your life? And that's like the objective measurement, but there's also a quality of life, subjective measurement in the moment as well, I think, that goes along with that point.
Yeah, and I think what should be acknowledged here is that everybody, in my opinion, should have permission to feel whichever emotion is coming up for them at the moment. And I think that goes back to developing skill in how you control your emotions as well, and whether or not they can be controlled. If you don't acknowledge what is, then you don't have a clear starting point. So letting yourself feel the full spectrum of emotions is part of learning how to perform that emotional aikido on yourself, where you can control your emotional experience and make it healthier for you.
I think it's unnerving for you. Sometimes we'll be like driving the car, we'll be in a conversation, and I'll be like super calm, and I'll just say something like, okay, this conversation is making me so angry right now. I feel like taking my hand and slamming it through the windshield. That's how angry I feel. It's like I'm saying it in such a calm, even tone way, and you're like, And basically what I'm doing there is I'm feeling like this strong sense of anger come up, and instead of going, oh, son of a, and like actually slamming something, I'm articulating I'm giving a like a verbalization of just how strong that emotion is for me. So it's this idea of, I gave myself permission to feel the anger. I didn't suppress that, but I also know it's not healthy to blast that anger towards you. You're not the cause of my anger. Maybe what we're talking about triggered me. It's my responsibility to now articulate that in a way that helps release maybe some of that anger without actually harming someone. And I can do that through words. That's how I've chosen to do it a lot of times. And it's really unnerving for people because I say things in such a calm manner, and underneath there's all this emotion behind it that I'm not trying to express outward or make the other person feel bad. So that's the other piece of this, is like that, what you just talked about, the idea of the expression of it versus the feeling of it. And I think giving yourself full permission to feel it is important, but the expression of it does have effects on other people. It can have effects on your environment, on the people around you, on yourself even. Like if I start expressing anger, I probably would potentially get even angrier, in the way I express it, but talking through it helps to manage that for me. So these are like little techniques that I've done, and I think that just plays into this whole idea of expression versus permission to feel.
Right. Are you de-escalating a situation or are you escalating it? Because our behavior feeds back into our emotion.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're intrinsically linked. And so if you want to help control your emotion, you give yourself permission to experience the emotion, but that doesn't mean you give yourself full permission to show up behaviorally blasting that outward and escalating a situation that feeds back into that emotion that may or may not be serving you. And I think the last thing I want to mention before we wrap this podcast up is something that we haven't really talked about, but I talked about in my YouTube video, which was this idea of an emotional thermostat.
Okay.
So, and I mentioned low vibration, high vibration in that particular podcast, in that video. And I think low vibration, high vibration for me goes back to this idea of extending, shortening life and increasing or decreasing quality of life in the meantime. So I don't really want to talk too much about high vibration, low vibration, but I do want to talk about the concept of the emotional thermostat, which is this idea that we have an emotional comfort zone. And we oftentimes find ourselves just like with our comfort zone on a thermostat. So in Fahrenheit terms, most of the time, my observation is most people's sweet spot or their comfort zone is somewhere between like 68 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. So most people have their house thermostat set around there. So if it gets too hot, the air conditioning comes on and brings it back down to 72, or if it gets too cold, it comes on and heats up the house to get back up to at least 68. But that's like that 4-degree, thermostat or comfort zone. And I think we do that with emotions too. I think we have like an emotion cluster sweet spot. And if any emotion comes up for us that is outside of that comfort zone, we will manufacture situations to get us back into that comfort zone. And in my opinion, the more quote unquote positive as we defined it by life extending emotions, the more your comfort zone is set to those styles of emotion like joy and fulfillment and satisfaction, the more likely you are to manufacture situations like when things get too bad. And I don't mean like when you have an experience of grief. It's not that you don't let yourself feel grief. You let yourself process through grief, but then you do what you can to get your circumstances in life back up to a place of joy and fulfillment and satisfaction, as opposed to being calibrated to an experience of something like grief or sadness or depression. So when positive things happen in your life, you manufacture a situation to get back into that space. And I really do believe that there is something to be said for increasing your emotional thermostat or comfort zone higher. And that way your highest highs become higher. Like you have the capacity to feel more positive emotions. And then when you hit something that's negative, it's not going to take you as far down. Not to say that you can't feel really, truly negative emotions like despair, right? Like that is contextually appropriate at times, but it's not something that you're going to be landing at comfortably. It'll be something that you process through. And then once you're done with it, you go, but I don't want to live here. I want to get back up to my comfort zone of something that's more, quote unquote positive as defined by life extending and higher quality of life in the meantime. So I do think that there's something to be said for that emotional thermostat. Yeah,
what you're talking about, humans were notorious for wanting homeostasis. We want to hit a balance between our highs and lows on all sorts of things, right? Like our temperature. And I remember having a conversation with my friend Dan about, I used to think it was food, clothing, and shelter we needed to survive. And I was like, I know we need food and water, obviously, but clothing and shelter are kind of interchangeable. I mean, if it's warm enough, you don't really need clothing. And if it's like not weather, like the weather's not bad, you wouldn't need shelter. And he and I had the conversation. He's like, well, it's actually homeostasis we need. It's the comfort level of like existence. Like we can't be too cold or hot. Our body temperature has to be regulated. So, and humans are about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit is the homeostasis temperature. Sometimes our temperature drops. Sometimes we get a fever to fight off an illness. But we live at 98.6 degrees, most of us. at that average like homeostasis temperature. And that's basically what we were talking about for emotions. Like there's a temperature gauge. Now, emotions aren't like our physicality where it's set at 98.6 and we can't change it. Emotions, we can decide where we want that set. We have someone in our life right now who has their emotional thermostat set so low. When I interact with this person, I bring positivity, joyfulness, energy, excitement, like good things. This person will start to match these emotions with me. And I notice within 5 minutes, they have to create drama, create a negative experience, sometimes shout, yell, explode, get upset, literally throw things at me. I've had this experience happen as well. This is a grown adult. And this is the past, not now. I wouldn't let that happen now. In the past, I've had things thrown at me by this individual. And they're an attempt to get their homeostasis back down to that calibrated midpoint setting on a very low level. And I would say that is low vibration in my opinion. We're talking about high vibration, low vibration. Okay, now we're entering the world of woo-woo a little bit. It's a little bit more metaphysical. It's more of like the impression of something. It's like this like intangible thing that we're talking about.
Well, I think it's the impact it has on your spirituality.
Sure.
And I say that as a completely non-religious person.
Yeah.
Like there is something to be said for how our spirit responds to things.
Yeah. I mean, there's the human spirit of stuff, and it's like, do we want to have a positive human spirit or a negative human spirit in a sense?
Overall, yeah.
And I think that's where it comes into. And so the thermostat thing, it makes so much sense to me because it's like, as people, like, okay, you don't believe that you want to have your thermostat set low. That's your decision. Fine, that's fine. I would posit to the world, we would all be happier and have a better experience if we all set our thermostats as high as we can do it. Like when I say high or low, I mean like the emotions that serve you well. I feel like there are emotions, and we did talk about the objective measurement of life extending and quality of life. I believe there are emotions that serve us better than other emotions. We need all the emotions in our toolbox, but when I go to fix something in my house, I don't use all the tools every time. Most times I'm using a screwdriver or a hammer to put something into the wall, like hang a picture. It's very rare I need to go grab my socket wrench to take like a bolt off of my bike, but I still need to have that tool accessible. I only use it like twice a year, but I still need to have it. So we're not talking about not having access to these things. It's just I'm not going to use my socket wrench to try to nail in a nail. That would be stupid. I'm going to use a hammer for that because it's the appropriate tool and it's the one I need most.
Yeah.
So I think this is like a little bit of where if we get pushed back around this thermostat idea, I think it makes so much sense to me. It's hard for me to see a perspective where someone wouldn't want their thermostat set high, or they would say, well, you need to be able to set it low. I just don't agree with that personally. That's my belief. That's how I show up to the world, or how I want to show up to the world.
Well, and obviously I agree with you because I created my video around that.
Yeah.
So I definitely agree with that as well. I think what it really comes down to though, and especially this is an area where, even that dude in Psychology Today is like, there are people on this side of the camp and people on this side of the camp, and psychology doesn't really say whichever one, which one it is. It does seem like the science says that we're flexible, but also the science says that, we're going to be triggered by certain things based on certain neural wiring. So like there's really no hard and fast rule on any of this. For me, it always goes back to what is the most empowering mindset.
Oh, yeah.
What's the mindset? What is the belief system around emotions that will create the most empowering place? And I think permission to feel the full spectrum of emotions, that's the first thing. Permission to feel it. But then also a belief that we have the control to set ourselves at the most rewarding set of emotions. And I would say that that's, to me, the most empowering mindset.
And if you're a person that you feel just incredibly empowered by having your thermostat or your emotions set low to what I would consider low vibration, more power to you. I don't know how that works. If you know how that works, and it's like giving you you feel like you show up to the world with tremendous personal power. You show up
sovereignty,
like not a victim. You show up like an empowered creator in your universe because you feel so negative and awful all the time. I want you to be a guest on this podcast, and I want you to articulate. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. Honestly, because I don't know how to get there. Yeah. I wouldn't know how to sit and live in that place and show up to the world empowered. Yeah. I haven't figured that piece out, and I feel very sophisticated with emotions. So if you figured that out, how to live with your thermostat set so low, in an empowered place, you're making big things happen in the world. You're changing people's lives. You're impacting them. They're feeling positive, or they're feeling really negative around you, and also feeling empowered, whatever the emotion you're helping them feel. If you're able to do that, I want to talk to you because, and I'm not kidding, this is not sarcastic. You keep smiling at me like you think I'm being sarcastic. I am not. I'm genuinely offering this invitation. You will be invited as a guest on this podcast. And I'm not talking about accessing these emotions. I'm talking about living there in an empowered state. I mean, besides like a Disney villain, I don't know. Like, I mean, they're empowered to evilness, I guess. But like, I just don't know how you live there and feel empowered in your life in that way. So I invite you to come on the podcast and help us with this, because I would love to know from your perspective if you're this type of person.
I'm smiling too, though, because I think that if a person defines themselves as empowered in those states, it's actually a phase of development where the person has probably just recently come out of feeling completely beholden to others.
That's probably true.
And so if they feel empowered by setting their vibration at quote unquote negative emotions, or the ones that are like traditionally considered more stressful, it's probably a phase that they're going through in order to feel like they're nobody's bitch. You know what I mean? Like they go through that phase where they're just like, I am allowed to feel these emotions. I think it's probably a time period of permission more than it is empowerment.
I could see like, okay, let's say you're an INFJ in the Myers-Briggs system, or an ENFJ, you feel jerked around and having to like always put on a happy face and smile in every interaction.
Or I would even say more like SFJs.
Or
ISFJs or ESFJs feel like they have to have the social face.
Yeah, you got the social face, and finally you're like, screw this. I'm taking control of my life. I'm just going to be a complete and totally empowered, negative feeling. I'm not going to smile. I'm going to snap at people. And you do that for like 4 months. Okay, I see how that could in the short term feel empowering. And I don't believe that would serve you ultimately to the end of your life going around like that. You probably wouldn't feel very good as an SFJ or an NFJ. Ultimately, it's going to hit a law of diminishing returns when you start to break harmony everywhere all the time. You're going to be like, I got to get back to harmony in my life. This is just not sustainable. So I just don't think someone can live there their whole life. I do believe like you said, I do believe there are probably very certain circumstances where that feels empowering for a time to live down there at that lower setting. However, in my experience, people that live there, they're miserable. They hate their life. They hate everybody around them. Or maybe they don't hate their life with everybody around them, but they just show up in a way that doesn't feel empowered to me. So I guess that's how I see it, and I can't apologize for that.
I think that actually brings up a good point, which is that we also go through phases of our emotions as we're growing and developing.
Sure.
Like, I think what we're talking about, this idea of being as much in control of your emotional experience as possible, being able to have full and complete permission to experience every emotion, but then recalibrating it back up to a positive as soon as you feel complete with that emotional experience. Using your behavior to craft your emotion, and then using the emotion to craft the behavior. And, and also giving yourself ability to, feel the most empowered feeling possible. We're talking about an ideal, right? We're talking about the acme of the mountain, this journey that we're all going through. And we're going to scale up at certain times and go, oh my gosh, I feel total permission to feel any emotion I want to. That means I can be a dick. I'm going to be a dick because I have permission around it, right? Like that could be a person's growth phase for a time. Like that could be what they've done to taught themselves to feel permission around being like, say, angry at a parent that abused them, or being upset with, or like grieving the loss of a loved one that they just, stuffed down. And so now they're depressed for a while. Like that could be actually a sign that they're in a growth phase. It doesn't mean that they're not. But then that is complete, and then they go back up, climbing up the precipice, and then their next phase of development could be around, controlling their behavior in a situation so that when they get triggered, they don't automatically react to that.
Yeah.
And so now that's what they're all about. Instead of giving themselves permission to feel something, now they're at a place where they're trying to like craft their emotional experience, or just stop the behavior so that they can craft it.
Yeah.
And so that's the next phase. And so if a person's trying to control their behavior so that they're not feeling just any emotion that they want to be feeling, somebody else at a different phase of growth might look at them and go, oh, no, you should be feeling permission. And they're like, yeah, but I already went through that. I already went through the permission thing. I'm done with that phase. Now I'm up to control. It depends on where you're at in your growth phase. And the point is that every single precipice you get to gets you closer and closer to an empowered position.
Yeah.
So it's hard to judge. It's hard to say, you should not be feeling permission to feel negative emotions, right? Like you should be controlling your emotions. Well, what if that person is at a permission level? Or you shouldn't be controlling all your emotions. You should be feeling permission to feel whatever you want to feel. Well, what if control is their level of development? So it's really hard from the outside to diagnose somebody and say that what they're doing is not the right thing.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're in an abusive situation, for example, and you're just saying, well, I'm just going to feel positive about the situation, like that's not empowering. Like you need to feel what you need to truly feel about like an abusive, maybe marriage relationship or relationship you're in, and feel the full expression so you can get empowered and make a change about that. I think those negative, quote unquote, negative or unuseful emotions in some contexts can be very positive and useful. Just like pain in our bodies, it alerts us that, hey, there's a problem. Your arm might be broken or there's a challenge in your muscle. Go get that checked out. That it's like a pain point that we need to pay attention to. I think the principle is you don't live there. You use those as tools, but you try to live an expression that lengthens your life and increases the quality of your life.
Yeah, like once the arm is healed, you don't keep it in a sling.
Exactly. And so I think that's the principle or the tone that we're trying to posit here.
Yeah.
Is that these are contextual. All emotions can be used as tools. The thermostat, we believe, is best served by being set higher than lower, and give yourself permission to work with your emotions, feel the emotions, but also think about how you can take control and steer the emotions the direction you'd like to steer them.
Right. And
is
progress.
The ultimate message.
Yeah, progress may vary. Like your progress is your progress, and you know where you're at on the timeline, and be okay with that. It's okay. We're painting an ideal. We're not there. I'm not there.
You're not.
Are you there?
No.
I mean, you might be there, but I'm definitely not there.
That was sarcastic. Are you not?
And so because we're all on a timeline of progression, that's when you enter a space of personal development, it is very difficult to make any hard and fast statements because it is going to contradict where a person is at no matter what. So we're painting the end game. We're not necessarily saying everybody should be at the end game, but I think what we've posited here is a pretty healthy end game. And that's even if it's not healthy for you, then throw it away. Like,
if it doesn't work for you, get rid of it. Yeah,
this is like the equivalent to like a diet, or exercise recommendation. It's like if it doesn't work for you, go do something else. But this is, in our observation, this is what has led to some of the healthiest results.
Yeah. What do you think? Are you having difficulty controlling emotion, the expression of it? Do you feel like emotions happen to you? Do you feel like you are in control of bringing up emotions you want to feel? When you do have emotions come up for you, how does that happen? Can you take control of it? Where are you at in this process? I mean, you're here with us in this conversation. You haven't been able to talk back to us, but we do want to hear from you. The best place to do that is to leave a comment or ask a question directly below this podcast over at personalityhacker.com. You can also join our community of like minds. We have great discussions happening over at facebook.com/personalityhacker where people talk about these issues. They may posit questions to the group and you get feedback from other like minds like yourself. And it's a really great supportive environment. We're always crafting it, making it better and better. So we want you to be a part of it because we believe that you would probably make that better having your voice represented there too. You can also go to twitter.com/personalityhack, and we're on other social media platforms of your choosing. You can find those all over at personalityhacker.com.
If you're not an exclusive podcast listener, if you also enjoy YouTube videos, I recommend that you go check out our new YouTube channels. They're under PH Antonia Dodge, PH Joel Mark Witt, PH Chelsea Irish, and PH Cheris Branson. And we all have a little bit of a different take on each of these subjects because we're all different personality types. Cheris is an INFJ, Chelsea's an INTJ, Joel's an ENFP, and I'm an ENTP. So you'll notice that our styles are different. You'll notice how we tackle topics is a little bit different. So go check out those channels. We think there's something of value for people in them. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you are in a particularly giving mood, a rating and review on iTunes helps us out a lot.
So I'm Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.